The smell hit me first. Copper and gunpowder, sharp enough to taste, acrid enough to burn the back of my throat as I stood frozen in the doorway of what was supposed to be my hotel room, but was very clearly someone else's nightmare made manifest. I should have run the second my hotel keycard opened the wrong door, should have turned on my exhausted, jet-lagged heels, and stumbled back down the hallway to the elevator that had deposited me on the 14th floor of the Hotel Vittorio just moments before. But my eyes had already locked onto the three men kneeling on the marble floor in the center of the opulent suite, their hands zip-tied behind their backs, and their faces painted with blood that looked black under the amber glow of the Murano glass chandelier, and onto him, the man in the Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than my entire year's salary, holding a silenced pistol like it was an extension of his hand, like the weight of it was as familiar to him as breathing. His cold gray eyes sliding from his victims to me with the slow, predatory focus of a shark scenting blood in the water. Time crystallized into something thick and viscous, each second stretching into an eternity as my brain struggled to process the scene before me, struggled to reconcile the exhaustion still clinging to my bones from 14 hours of travel with the very real, very immediate danger that my stumbling into this room represented. I'd left Boston's Logan Airport yesterday morning with nothing but a carry-on suitcase, a confirmation email for a boutique hotel in Rome's Trastevere neighborhood, and the desperate hope that 3 weeks alone in Italy would help me figure out what I wanted from my life now that I'd finally ended my engagement to Marcus, finally admitted that a safe, predictable future with a safe, predictable man in our safe, predictable Cambridge apartment was slowly suffocating every spontaneous impulse I'd ever possessed. The travel agent had called this trip Finding Yourself in the Eternal City, had promised me that Rome would awaken something in me that had gone dormant during my 26 years of careful choices and calculated risks. But I'm fairly certain she hadn't meant that I would find myself standing in a penthouse suite, watching what appeared to be a very organized, very professional execution in progress. The man with the gun, because that's what he was in this moment. Not a person, but a presence, a force of nature contained in an absurdly expensive suit, tilted his head slightly as he studied me, and I watched his free hand lift in a gesture so subtle it was almost imperceptible, watched the massive wall of muscle and malice that had been standing behind the kneeling men move toward me with surprising speed for someone who had to be at least 6.5 feet tall and 250 pounds of pure menace. My survival instincts finally kicked in, sending adrenaline flooding through my system in a cold rush that made my fingers tingle and my vision sharpen with sudden, terrible clarity, and I stumbled backward, my hand still gripping my suitcase handle like it was some kind of talisman that could protect me from the reality of what I'd just witnessed, my mouth opening to scream or apologize or beg. I wasn't sure which. Stop. The word came from the man with the gun, spoken in English but wrapped in an accent that turned the single syllable into something almost musical, almost beautiful despite the circumstances, and the massive enforcer froze mid-step, his ham-sized fist already reaching for the collar of my rumpled travel cardigan, his small, dark eyes glittering with something that might have been amusement or might have been anticipation of violence. I couldn't tell which and didn't want to find out. The suited man moved then, crossing the space between us with the fluid grace of a predator who'd never once in his life had to hurry, who knew with absolute certainty that his prey had nowhere to run and all the time in the world to be caught. And I found myself pressing back against the doorframe even though every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to run, to move, to do literally anything except stand there like a deer caught in headlights while he approached with that gun still held loosely in his right hand, his left hand sliding into his pocket with casual elegance. Up close, he was devastating in a way that had nothing to do with conventional attractiveness, and everything to do with the sheer force of his presence. The sharp planes of his face, all brutal angles and aristocratic bones. His dark hair swept back from his forehead in a style that belonged in a different century. His gray eyes, the color of winter storms, and just as merciless as they catalogued every detail of my appearance, with an intensity that made me feel stripped bare despite being fully clothed in my travel-wrinkled jeans and cardigan. "You are lost, Bella Turista," he said. And it wasn't a question but a statement of fact delivered in that accented English that my exhausted, terrified brain registered as Italian even as I struggled to form words around the panic constricting my throat. This is not your room, I think, unless you have developed very interesting tastes in accommodations during your journey to my beautiful city. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of his words, at the almost conversational tone he used while holding a weapon that had very likely been used to end lives, while 3 beaten men knelt on the floor behind him, waiting for whatever fate he'd already decided for them. But the sound that came out of my mouth was something closer to a whimper, a pathetic little noise that made me hate myself, even as I fought to find my voice. "I'm sorry," I managed, and the words tumbled out in a rush that I couldn't control, fueled by terror and jet lag and the surreal disconnect between the nightmare I'd stumbled into and the peaceful vacation I'd imagined. The front desk gave me a key card, room 1408. But it must have been wrong. It must have been some kind of mistake because I just got in from Boston and I'm so tired and I just wanted to sleep. And I didn't see anything. I swear I didn't see anything. Please just let me go. And I promise I won't tell anyone what I saw here. I don't even know what I saw here. I don't know who you are or what's happening. And I just want to go back downstairs and sort out my room situation and pretend this never happened. Something flickered across his face, too quick for me to identify before his expression settled back into that mask of cold assessment. And he reached past me with his free hand to push the door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded like a death knell in the suddenly silent suite. "You are tired from your journey. You want to sleep. You promise not to tell anyone what you have seen," he repeated, his voice taking on a thoughtful quality that somehow scared me more than if he'd shouted or threatened, because it suggested he was actually considering my words, actually weighing them against whatever calculations were running through his mind. "These are all very reasonable desires, Piccola, very understandable requests from a frightened American woman who has found herself in a situation that she does not comprehend. But I am afraid that what you want and what I can allow are 2 very different things at this particular moment." He shifted slightly, angling his body so that he stood between me and the 3 kneeling men, blocking my view of them as if to spare me further exposure to the scene I'd already witnessed. And the gesture was so unexpectedly considerate given the circumstances that it made my already precarious emotional state wobble dangerously. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question was so normal, so ordinary in its social convention, that it took me several seconds to process it. Several seconds to drag my name up from the depths of my panic-stricken mind. "Isla," I whispered, then cleared my throat and tried again with more volume, more conviction than I felt. "Isla Moretti. I'm an art curator from Boston. I'm here on vacation. I'm supposed to be staying in this hotel for 3 nights before I move to an apartment I rented in Trastevere for the rest of my trip. And I really, truly didn't mean to walk in here. I promise this was just a horrible mistake with the key cards." His eyes sharpened at something I'd said, some detail that had caught his attention, and I watched him process the information with visible interest, his gaze traveling over me again, but this time with different intent, as if he was reassessing me based on this new knowledge. "Moretti," he repeated, rolling the syllables around his mouth like he was tasting them, testing them for authenticity. "An Italian name for an American girl who curates art. How very interesting. How very convenient that you have walked into my room on this particular night when I am conducting business that relates very closely to your profession." Dread pooled in my stomach, cold and heavy, because there was something in his tone that suggested this was more than just terrible timing, more than just a simple mistake with hotel keycards, and I shook my head even as fresh tears burned behind my eyes. "I don't understand what you mean. I don't know anything about your business. I just want to leave. Please just let me leave, and I swear on everything I hold sacred that I will never speak about this to anyone. You'll never see me again. I'll check out of this hotel and find somewhere else to stay, and you can forget I ever existed." He smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen on a human face. Beautiful and cold and entirely devoid of warmth. The kind of smile that promised pain wrapped in silk. Death delivered with impeccable manners. "But you see, Bella Isla, That is precisely the problem with your very generous offer to disappear from my life and my city, he said, reaching up with his free hand to brush a strand of my dark hair back from my face in a gesture that would have been tender, if not for the gun still held casually in his other hand, if not for the 3 bleeding men still kneeling behind him, if not for the complete lack of mercy in those winter storm eyes. The hotel security cameras will show you entering this room, will create a record of your presence here at this very inopportune moment. And while I have people who can make such recordings disappear, there will always be the question of what you saw, what you might remember, what you might tell the authorities if you were ever questioned about events that may or may not have occurred in this suite tonight. The implication of his words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and making my knees weak with the sudden, terrible understanding of just how much danger I was truly in, and I felt myself sway slightly as the exhaustion and terror combined into something overwhelming, something that threatened to drag me under. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated, cedar and bergamot, and something darker that I couldn't identify. Close enough that I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, close enough that he could catch me if I fell, though whether he would let me hit the floor or not was anyone's guess. "Please," I breathed, and I hated the way my voice broke on the word, hated the tears that finally spilled over and tracked hot paths down my cheeks, hated the weakness I was showing in front of this beautiful, terrifying stranger who held my life in his perfectly manicured hands. "Please, I have a family. I have people who care about me. I have a whole life back in Boston waiting for me to return. Please don't hurt me. Please just let me go." He studied my face for a long moment, his expression unreadable, his thumb moving almost absently to catch one of my tears before it could fall from my jaw, and I watched him examine the moisture on his skin, like it was something curious, something he didn't often encounter in his carefully controlled world of violence and power. Then he stepped back, pulling his phone from his pocket with practiced ease, and pressed a button that connected him to someone on the other end, while his eyes never left my face, never stopped cataloging every minute change in my expression as I stood there trembling and crying, and utterly at his mercy. He spoke in rapid Italian, the words flowing too quickly for my limited language skills to catch more than a few fragments. Problema, testimone, decidere. And I watched his face remain impassive as whoever was on the other end responded, watched him nod once, twice, then end the call with the same casual efficiency with which he'd made it. The silence that followed felt suffocating, oppressive in its weight, and I found myself holding my breath as I waited for him to pronounce my fate, to tell me whether I would walk out of this room alive or become just another problem solved with brutal efficiency. "You will come with me, Isla Moretti," he finally said, gesturing toward the interior of the suite with the gun that he still hadn't bothered to put away. And when I didn't immediately move, frozen by fear and indecision, he sighed with what might have been impatience, or might have been something else entirely. "I am not going to kill you here in this doorway where your blood would stain very expensive Italian marble and create complications that I do not currently have time to address, so you may take some small comfort in that fact, as you make the very wise decision to do exactly as I tell you, and walk further into this room where we can discuss your immediate future in more comfortable surroundings." The massive enforcer moved then, his hand closing around my upper arm with enough pressure to make his intentions clear without actually causing pain, and I found myself being guided away from the door, away from my only escape route, deeper into the penthouse suite where 3 beaten men still knelt in silence, and the beautiful monster in the Tom Ford suit watched me with those merciless gray eyes that promised absolutely nothing except that my carefully planned vacation to find myself in the Eternal City had just become something far more dangerous, far more complicated, and far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined when I'd boarded that plane in Boston just yesterday morning, with my heart full of hope and my head full of dreams about new beginnings. He didn't kill me that first night, which somehow felt worse than if he had, because instead of the quick, brutal end that I'd spent hours imagining in vivid, terrifying detail as I lay curled on the massive bed in the locked bedroom where his enforcer had deposited me after the man in the Tom Ford suit had finished making phone calls in rapid Italian while I sat, trembling on a leather sofa that probably cost more than my car. I woke to watery Roman sunlight filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows and the disorienting realization that I was still alive, still breathing, still trapped in what had transformed from a nightmare into something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. The room where I'd eventually cried myself into fitful sleep was decorated with the kind of understated luxury that whispered old money and older power, all cream-colored silk wallpaper and antique furniture that belonged in a museum rather than a hotel suite. And as I pushed myself upright on sheets that felt like liquid against my skin, I caught sight of my reflection in an ornate gilded mirror across the room and barely recognized the wild-eyed woman staring back at me, her dark hair tangled around her shoulders and her face pale with exhaustion and residual fear. The sound of a key turning in the lock made my heart leap into my throat, made every muscle in my body tense with the anticipation of violence or worse. But when the door swung open, it wasn't the massive enforcer from last night, but rather the man himself, the beautiful monster who'd decided my fate with a series of phone calls, and he entered my prison carrying a tray that held what appeared to be espresso in delicate porcelain cups and pastries that filled the room with the scent of butter and sugar and something I couldn't quite identify, but that made my traitorous stomach clench with hunger despite the circumstances. He'd changed from the suit into dark slacks and a white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with lean muscle and decorated with what looked like the edge of a tattoo disappearing under the fabric. And his hair was slightly damp as if he'd recently showered, and the whole domestic normalcy of his appearance was so jarring against the memory of him holding that gun, speaking those words in Italian that had sealed whatever fate awaited me, that I found myself unable to do anything except stare at him, with my mouth slightly open and my brain struggling to process this new version of my captor. "Buongiorno, Isla Moretti," he said, setting the tray down on the small table near the window with careful precision, before turning those winter storm eyes on me with an expression that might have been amusement, or might have been something darker lurking beneath the surface of his carefully controlled features. "I have brought you breakfast because I suspect you did not eat during your journey yesterday. And while I am many things that your American sensibilities would find objectionable, I am not the sort of man who allows a guest in his home to go hungry, even when that guest is here under circumstances that are less than ideal for both of us." Guest. The word was so absurd, so disconnected from the reality of my situation, that I felt a slightly hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat before I managed to swallow it down and force myself to speak with something approximating calm, even though my hands were shaking where they clutched the silk sheets. "I'm not a guest. I'm a prisoner," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I'd intended, scraped raw from the crying I'd done in the dark hours of the night, when I'd allowed myself to fully comprehend just how completely my life had derailed in the span of a single evening. Guests are free to leave whenever they want. Guests aren't locked in bedrooms by armed criminals who threaten them with security camera footage and vague implications about what might happen if they try to escape. He moved to the window, his back to me as he gazed out at the Rome skyline visible beyond the glass, and I watched the line of his shoulders beneath that crisp white shirt, watched the way he held himself with the absolute confidence of a man who'd never once doubted his place in the world or his ability to bend that world to his will through whatever means necessary. "You are correct that your situation is not one of traditional hospitality, piccola curatrice," he acknowledged, and the Italian endearment, little curator, should not have made something flutter in my chest the way it did, should not have softened the edges of my fear even fractionally. But there was something in the way he said it that suggested he'd been thinking about me, about what I'd told him regarding my profession, about the details of my life that I'd spilled in my panic. "However, I would argue that you are also not precisely a prisoner, because a prisoner implies that you have done something wrong, that you are being held as punishment for crimes committed, and you have done nothing except be extraordinarily unlucky in your choice of hotel keycards and extraordinarily poor in your timing when you decided to enter a room that was very much not your own." He turned back to face me then, leaning against the window frame with casual elegance that should have looked studied or artificial, but instead seemed entirely natural, as if he'd been born to stand in expensive rooms and make pronouncements about the fates of unwitting American tourists who'd stumbled into his world. "So I propose we call you something else, something that more accurately reflects your current status in my home," he continued, moving toward the breakfast tray and pouring espresso into both cups, with practiced ease before carrying one over to where I still sat frozen on the bed, extending it toward me like a peace offering wrapped in porcelain and caffeine. "You are my ospit involuntaria, my involuntary guest, and you will remain here in comfort and safety until I can determine exactly what to do with you and the rather significant problem that your presence represents for my business interests and my family's continued prosperity." I took the espresso because my hands needed something to do, besides shake, because the warmth of the cup grounded me in a reality that still felt surreal and dreamlike, and because some part of me recognized that refusing his gesture would accomplish nothing except possibly angering him, and I had no desire to see what this man looked like when his carefully maintained control slipped into actual rage. The espresso was perfect, rich and strong, and exactly what my jet-lagged system needed, and I hated that I noticed this detail. Hated that I could appreciate the quality of something he'd brought me while simultaneously being terrified of what he might decide my fate should be. "You said last night that this relates to my profession," I managed, after taking a sip that burned pleasantly down my throat. My mind latching onto this detail because it was concrete, because it was something I could potentially understand in a situation that had spun so far beyond my comprehension that I felt like I was drowning in uncertainty. "What does art curation have to do with whatever business you were conducting with those men? What could I possibly know that would make my accidental presence here such a significant problem?" His expression shifted into something that looked almost like approval, as if he appreciated that I was trying to think through the situation rationally, rather than dissolving into hysterics again. And he settled into the chair across from the bed with his own espresso cradled in long fingers, that I tried very hard not to remember, wrapped around the grip of a silenced pistol. "The men you saw last night were traders who had been selling information about my family's operations to our competitors. Operations that include the acquisition and movement of certain valuable artifacts through channels that your government and mine would consider less than legitimate," he explained, with the kind of casual directness that suggested he saw no point in lying to me about the nature of his business. Perhaps because he'd already decided that I would never be in a position to share this information with anyone who mattered. "Your museum in Boston, the prestigious institution where you work as a curator of Italian Renaissance pieces, if I remember correctly from our conversation last night, has recently acquired several paintings and sculptures from anonymous European donors, has it not?" The question hit me like a bucket of ice water, shocking in its specificity and terrifying in its implications, and I felt my hands tighten around the espresso cup hard enough that I worried briefly about shattering the delicate porcelain. "How do you know about acquisitions at my museum? How could you possibly have information about donations that haven't even been publicly announced yet?" I demanded, my curator's instinct for protecting my institution's reputation momentarily overriding my fear of the man asking these questions. "Those pieces went through extensive provenance verification. We have documentation dating back decades for each acquisition. We would never knowingly accept stolen artwork or anything with questionable origins." He smiled that terrible, beautiful smile again, the one that promised pain delivered with perfect manners, and leaned forward slightly in his chair, as if sharing a secret with a confidant rather than explaining criminal enterprise to a woman he was holding against her will. "I know about these acquisitions, cara mia, because several of those pieces passed through my family's hands before they were carefully cleaned of their true provenance and presented to your museum with flawless documentation that cost a great deal of money and effort to produce," he said, watching my face with evident interest as the implications of his words sank in like stones dropping into still water. I know because the operation to move those particular items from their original locations in private collections across Europe to your museum's climate-controlled storage facilities was one that I personally oversaw. And I know because the traders you witnessed being questioned last night were the ones who sold information about this operation to people who would very much like to see my family's business disrupted and our reputation for discretion and reliability destroyed. The room spun slightly around me as I processed what he was telling me, as I mentally catalogued the recent acquisitions that matched his description and felt sick with the realization that pieces I'd authenticated, pieces I'd recommended for purchase, pieces I'd been excited to eventually display in our Renaissance gallery might have origins far darker than the carefully constructed paperwork had suggested. "You're saying my museum is a front for laundering stolen art," I said flatly, needing to hear myself speak the words aloud to make them real, to force myself to confront this new reality that was reshaping everything I thought I understood about my professional life. "You're saying that I've been unknowingly helping criminals move stolen artwork across international borders and into legitimate institutions where they can be sold, or displayed, or whatever it is you people do with priceless cultural artifacts that don't belong to you." His head tilted slightly in a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or might have been consideration of my phrasing, and he took a slow sip of his espresso before responding in that accented English that made even terrible revelations sound almost lyrical. "I am saying that your museum is one of many institutions worldwide that serves multiple purposes for multiple parties, some of whom are aware of these arrangements, and some of whom, like yourself, are simply very good at their jobs and very trusting of the documentation presented to them by their superiors," he corrected, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was making a distinction that mattered to him, even if I couldn't quite grasp why. "I am also saying that your presence here, your accidental witnessing of my interrogation of the men who betrayed my family's trust, creates a unique situation that I find both problematic and potentially useful in ways that I am still determining." I set down my espresso cup because my hands were shaking too badly to trust myself not to spill it, and I wrapped my arms around myself as if that could provide some protection against the cold dread spreading through my chest at his words, at the calculating look in his eyes that suggested he was already several moves ahead in whatever game he was playing with my life as one of the pieces. "What does that mean? Potentially useful? What could I possibly offer you that would make keeping me alive worth whatever risk my continued existence represents?" I asked, hating the desperation I could hear creeping into my voice but unable to stop it. Unable to maintain the facade of calm when every instinct I possessed was screaming that I was in danger far more complex than simple physical threat. He rose from his chair with fluid grace and moved to stand by the window again, his profile sharp against the light flooding in from outside. And when he spoke, his voice had taken on a quality I couldn't quite identify, something that lived in the space between threat and promise. "You are going to help me identify which of your colleagues at the museum are knowing participants in the laundering operation and which are innocents like yourself. You are going to provide me with information about upcoming acquisitions and authentication processes. And you are going to do this because the alternative is that I turn you over to the authorities with carefully constructed evidence, suggesting that you were the one selling information about my family's operations to our competitors," he said, turning to face me fully so I could see the absolute certainty in his expression, the complete confidence that I would comply with whatever demands he made. "Or perhaps, if you prove to be less cooperative than I hope, I simply ensure that you disappear entirely. Another tragic American tourist who went missing in Rome and was never seen again. A cautionary tale for travelers who should have been more careful about where they wandered." The threat was delivered with such casual elegance that it took my brain several seconds to process the full weight of what he was saying. Several seconds to understand that he was offering me a choice between becoming his informant or becoming his victim. And neither option included the one thing I desperately wanted, which was to wake up from this nightmare and find myself back in my safe, boring life in Boston, where the most dangerous thing I encountered was aggressive drivers on the Mass Pike. And if I agree to help you, if I provide the information you want, what guarantee do I have that you'll ever let me go, That you won't just keep using me until I'm no longer useful and then eliminate me anyway? I asked, forcing myself to meet his eyes even though everything in me wanted to look away from the winter-cold assessment I found. There. Something flickered across his face again. That same expression I'd seen last night when I'd told him my name, when he'd heard that I was a curator, and he crossed the room to stand beside the bed, looking down at me with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat, for reasons that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the unwanted awareness of just how devastating this man was when he focused the full force of his attention on you. You have my word, Piccola Curatrice, and while I understand that means very little to you given the circumstances of our meeting, I can tell you that in my world, in the business I conduct and the life I lead, my word is the only currency that truly matters, he said, reaching out to tuck another strand of my hair behind my ear in a gesture that was becoming disturbingly familiar, disturbingly intimate in a way that made my skin heat despite every rational objection my brain was raising. Help me protect my family's interests. Help me identify the threats within your museum's structure, and when this situation is resolved to my satisfaction, you will return to your life in Boston with enough money to ensure that you never have to work again if you choose not to, and with the understanding that we will never speak of what transpired during your unfortunate stay in Rome. He moved toward the door then, pausing with his hand on the handle to look back at me where I sat frozen on the bed, trying to process everything he'd told me, trying to decide if I had any choice at all in what came next or if this was simply him allowing me the illusion of agency, while he maneuvered me exactly where he wanted me to go. I am going out for several hours to attend to business that requires my personal attention, and Kozlov will be stationed outside your door to ensure your safety and your continued presence in this room, he said, and the slight emphasis on safety suggested he was aware of how that word sounded coming from the man who was holding me captive. When I return this evening, you and I will discuss the specifics of our arrangement over dinner, and you will have had time to consider your options and make the choice that I think we both know you will make. Because you are an intelligent woman who understands that survival sometimes requires cooperation with people we would prefer to oppose. He opened the door, revealing the massive form of Kozlov standing guard in the hallway beyond, and I watched him prepare to leave. Watched him straighten his shirt cuffs with the same casual elegance he brought to everything he did, and I found my voice just as he was about to step through the doorway. I don't even know your name, I said, and the words came out smaller than I'd intended, more vulnerable than I wanted to sound. But they were true, and they mattered because if I was going to be trapped in this situation with this man, if I was going to be forced to make impossible choices about cooperation and survival, then I at least deserved to know what to call the beautiful monster who held my life in his perfectly manicured hands. He paused, turning back to face me with an expression that might have been surprise or might have been something else entirely. And when he spoke, his voice had softened almost imperceptibly, had lost some of that cold edge that had characterized our entire interaction up until this moment. Dante, he said simply, and the name suited him in a way that made perfect sense. Made me think of Italian poetry and divine justice and circles of hell that people descended into thinking they could escape but finding themselves trapped forever. My name is Dante Sovereign, and you, Isla Moretti, are going to help me destroy the people who betrayed my family's trust. And in doing so, you are going to discover that the world you thought you understood, the safe little existence you built for yourself in Boston with your museum and your broken engagement, and your desperate need to find yourself in my city, was nothing but a carefully constructed illusion that was always destined to shatter the moment you walked through the wrong door. He left then, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft click that I heard echoed by the sound of the lock engaging, and I sat alone in my beautiful prison with the taste of espresso still on my tongue and the weight of impossible choices pressing down on my chest like a physical thing, wondering how it was possible that just 24 hours ago I'd been standing in Logan Airport, thinking that the biggest risk I was taking was traveling to Europe alone for the first time in my life, completely unaware that the real danger wouldn't come from pickpockets or getting lost in unfamiliar streets, but from a man named Dante Sovereign, who'd looked at me with those winter storm eyes and seen not a person but a tool, not a woman but a weapon to be used against his enemies, and who'd somehow made me consider actually helping him, even though every moral principle I'd ever held was screaming at me that cooperation with a criminal, no matter how beautiful or how compelling his arguments, was a line I should never, ever allow myself to cross. The dress he sent to my room cost more than my monthly rent. Blood-red silk that clung to every curve like a possessive hand. His hand, I realized with a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air-conditioned suite. When he arrived exactly 2 hours after the stylist had departed, and proceeded to dismiss the woman with a gesture before stepping behind me to zip up the back of the gown himself, his fingers deliberately grazing the length of my spine, in a touch that burned through the thin fabric, and made every nerve ending in my body light up with an awareness I desperately wished I could suppress. I'd spent the day in a fog of anxiety and unwanted anticipation, knowing that Dante would return as promised, knowing that I would have to give him my answer about cooperation even though we both understood I had no real choice in the matter. And when Kozlov had unlocked my door, 3 hours before sunset, to allow entry to a severe-looking Italian woman carrying garment bags and makeup cases, I'd realized with creeping dread that whatever Dante had planned for this evening involved more than just a dinner conversation in the privacy of his penthouse suite. Perfetta, Dante murmured behind me as he finished with the zipper, his breath warm against the nape of my neck, where the stylist had arranged my dark hair into an elegant updo that exposed the vulnerable column of my throat. And I watched our reflection in the full-length mirror that dominated one wall of the bedroom, watched the way we looked together with him in his perfectly tailored midnight blue suit that probably cost more than my car and me in this dress that transformed me into someone I barely recognized. Someone who looked like she belonged in his world of dangerous elegance and casual violence. You will do very nicely for what I require this evening, piccola curatrice. Very nicely indeed for the role you are about to play in front of people who would kill us both without hesitation if they suspected for even a moment that you are anything other than what I will present you to be. My reflection's eyes widened at his words, at the casual mention of death delivered in that accent that made even threats sound like poetry. And I turned to face him directly rather than continue watching our dual image in the mirror, needing to see his expression when I asked the question that had been building in my mind since the stylist had first revealed the dress. What exactly am I supposed to be? What role are you asking me to play that requires this kind of preparation and warrants warnings about people who might want to kill us? I demanded, hating the way my voice shook slightly despite my attempt at firmness, hating that I could smell his cologne again, that same cedar and bergamot and something darker that I'd noticed last night, and hating even more that some traitorous part of my brain was cataloging these details, storing them away as if they mattered, as if knowing what Dante Sovereign smelled like was information worth preserving. He moved to the small table where the stylist had left a jewelry box, opening it to reveal a necklace that made my curator's eye immediately recognize the quality and age of the piece. Diamonds and sapphires set in what looked like platinum from the Art Deco period. Probably worth more than everything I'd ever owned in my entire life combined. And he lifted it from its velvet nest with careful reverence before approaching me again, with clear intent to fasten it around my neck himself. You are going to be my American girlfriend, my infatuated lover who cannot keep her hands off me or her eyes from following my every movement, my beautiful distraction who accompanied me to Rome from your home in Boston, because you cannot bear to be separated from me for even the length of a business trip, he explained as he moved behind me once more, and I felt the cool weight of the necklace settle against my collarbones before his fingers worked the clasp at the back of my neck with practiced ease that suggested he'd done this before, had dressed other women in expensive jewelry for whatever purposes his business required. Tonight, we are attending a gala at a historic palazzo hosted by a family whose relationship with my own organization has become strained in recent months, and your presence at my side serves multiple purposes, not least of which is to present the image of a man who is relaxed and confident enough in his position to bring his lover to what is essentially enemy territory. The casual way he described attending a party at the home of people he clearly considered threats made my stomach clench with fresh anxiety, made me acutely aware of how far out of my depth I'd sunk in the 36 hours since I'd walked through that wrong door, and I reached up instinctively to touch the necklace now adorning my throat, feeling the weight of the stones and the cool metal and understanding with sudden clarity that this was not just jewelry but a collar, a mark of ownership that would tell everyone at this gala exactly who I belonged to. And what happens if I can't play this role convincingly? What happens if someone at this party realizes I'm not actually your girlfriend, but rather a terrified curator you're holding prisoner in your hotel suite? I asked, meeting his eyes in the mirror as he stepped back to survey his handiwork, to assess whether I met whatever standards he'd set for my appearance at this event. His expression hardened almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift in the planes of his face that transformed him from devastatingly attractive to genuinely dangerous in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and he moved around to face me directly, reaching up to cup my jaw in one hand with just enough pressure to make his point without causing actual pain. If you cannot play this role convincingly, if you give anyone at this gala reason to suspect that you are anything other than a willing participant in our relationship, then people who have done nothing to deserve such a fate will suffer for your failure, he said. And the quiet intensity of his words was somehow more terrifying than if he'd shouted or threatened directly. My driver who brought you your breakfast this morning, the maid who changed your sheets while you bathed, the concierge at the front desk who made the error with your keycard that brought you to my door. These people and others like them throughout this hotel will pay the price for your inability to smile and touch me and convince a room full of criminals that you are desperately in love with Dante Sovereign. The threat was effective precisely because it was so specific, because he'd identified people I'd already encountered in my brief time as his captive, people whose faces I could remember and whose suffering would haunt me if my actions caused them harm, and I felt tears of frustration and fear burning behind my eyes, even as I forced myself not to look away from his cold assessment of my reaction. That's not fair. You can't hold innocent people hostage to ensure my cooperation. You can't threaten to hurt others just to make me comply with whatever sick game you're playing, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew how foolish they sounded, knew that fairness and morality were concepts that held no weight in Dante's world of violence and calculated cruelty. He released my jaw and stepped back, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw a small envelope that he pressed into my hands with deliberate care. And when I opened it with trembling fingers, I found photographs inside, candid shots of the people he'd mentioned. The driver, the maid, the concierge, all going about their daily routines, completely unaware that they'd been documented as potential targets. I can, and I will, do whatever is necessary to protect my interests and ensure your cooperation, cara mia. Because unlike you with your comfortable American morality and your belief that people should play by rules that make you feel safe, I understand that survival in my world requires a willingness to do things that would horrify your delicate sensibilities, he said. And there was something almost like regret in his voice, almost like he wished he could be the kind of man who didn't need to make such threats, but had long ago accepted that he wasn't, and never would be. So you will get in the car that is waiting for us downstairs, you will sit close to me during the drive to the palazzo, and you will spend the evening touching me, smiling at me, and looking at me with the kind of adoration that suggests you find me utterly irresistible, because the alternative is that innocent people suffer for your pride and your resistance to a situation that you cannot change through stubbornness or moral objections. The car was exactly as I'd expected. Sleek, black, expensive, and Dante kept his hand possessively on my lower back as we walked through the hotel lobby, guiding me past curious staff members and guests who stared at us with the kind of attention that beautiful people in expensive clothes always attracted. And I forced myself to lean into him slightly, to tilt my head toward his as if he was whispering sweet nothings rather than instructions about how to behave once we arrived at our destination. The drive through Rome's evening streets should have been magical. Should have been the kind of experience I'd dreamed about when I'd booked this trip. The ancient city glowing golden in the sunset, while we passed landmarks I'd only seen in photographs. But instead, I spent the journey acutely aware of Dante's thigh pressed against mine in the back seat, of his arm draped across my shoulders, in a gesture that looked casual but felt like a cage, of the way he occasionally bent his head to murmur additional instructions that his driver couldn't hear over the partition, separating the front and back seats. The family hosting tonight's gala is called Valenti, and they have been attempting to expand into territories that my family has controlled for 3 generations, using tactics that violate agreements that have kept peace between our organizations for longer than you have been alive, Dante explained as we navigated through traffic, his fingers tracing absent patterns on my bare shoulder that made my skin prickle with unwanted awareness. The patriarch, Riccardo Valenti, is a man who respects strength and despises any display of weakness or uncertainty. So when we are in his presence, you will remain silent unless directly addressed. You will keep your eyes appropriately downcast, in a way that suggests you are aware of your place as my companion, but not so submissive that you appear to be a victim. And you will under no circumstances react with visible emotion if you witness or overhear things that disturb you, because any sign that you are uncomfortable will be interpreted as my failure to control my woman and will undermine the authority I need to maintain in this negotiation. The list of rules and expectations felt endless. Felt like I was being prepared for a performance in a play where I didn't know my lines, and the audience was composed entirely of people who would happily kill me if I delivered my dialogue incorrectly. And I found myself nodding along to his instructions while my mind raced with questions about how I'd ended up here. About how a simple vacation meant to help me figure out what I wanted from my life had transformed into this surreal nightmare where I was being dressed up like a doll and paraded in front of criminals as proof of Dante Sovereign's confidence and control. The palazzo when we arrived was everything I'd imagined, and more. A Renaissance masterpiece of architecture that had clearly been maintained and updated over the centuries, while preserving the historical elements that made it breathtaking. And as Dante helped me from the car, with courtly manners that would have been charming in any other context, I caught sight of other guests arriving in similar vehicles, women dripping with jewels and men radiating the kind of casual menace that suggested they were all players in the same deadly game that Dante navigated with such apparent ease. His hand found its home on my lower back again as we climbed the stone steps leading to the palazzo's entrance, and I was acutely conscious of the eyes tracking our progress, of the whispered conversations that surely centered on Dante's choice to bring an unknown American woman to this gathering. And I forced myself to remember the photographs in that envelope, forced myself to think about the innocent people who would suffer if I failed to play my role convincingly, enough to satisfy whatever audience we were about to face. The interior of the palazzo was a museum come to life, every surface decorated with frescoes or tapestries or sculptures that made my curator's heart ache with the desire to examine them properly, to study their provenance and appreciate their beauty in circumstances that didn't involve pretending to be the lover of a man who trafficked in stolen art and casual violence. And I felt Dante's grip on my waist tighten slightly as if he could sense my distraction and was warning me to focus on the task at hand rather than on the treasures surrounding us. Dante Sovereign, what an unexpected pleasure to see you at my home after the unfortunate misunderstanding between our families last month. The voice came from our right, feminine and sharp as a blade wrapped in silk, and I turned to see a woman who could only be described as devastating in the way that certain predators are beautiful, all sleek lines and dangerous curves poured into a gown that probably cost as much as the necklace I was wearing. Her dark hair swept back from a face that was striking, rather than conventionally pretty. Her eyes assessing me with the kind of cold calculation that made me feel suddenly, acutely aware of how out of place I was in this world of practiced cruelty and elegant menace. And you've brought a guest. How very bold of you to parade your new acquisition in front of all these people who would be so very interested to know everything about the woman who has apparently captured the attention of the sovereign heir. Dante's entire body language shifted in response to this woman's approach, his casual elegance taking on an edge of wariness that I could feel in the tension of his muscles where they pressed against me. And when he smiled at her, it was with the kind of controlled politeness that suggested a much more complicated history than simple business rivalry. "Lucia Valenti, you look as beautiful as ever, and your father has outdone himself with this evening's arrangements," he said smoothly, and I watched him execute a subtle bow that managed to be both respectful and somehow mocking in its perfection. "Allow me to introduce Isla Moretti, who has graciously agreed to accompany me to Rome from her home in Boston, where she curates Italian Renaissance art for one of America's most prestigious museums. I thought she might appreciate the opportunity to see pieces from your family's famous collection that rarely leave the palazzo walls." Lucia's eyes, dark and venomous as a serpent's, fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch, and I felt Dante's hand move from my back to my hip in a gesture that was clearly possessive, clearly meant to communicate something to this woman who was regarding me like I was a particularly interesting specimen she was considering dissecting. "A curator, how absolutely fascinating, and an expert in Renaissance art no less," Lucia purred, circling around me slowly like a predator assessing prey, and I forced myself to remain still, to keep my expression neutral even as every instinct screamed at me to put distance between myself and this woman who radiated danger from every perfectly manicured gesture. "Tell me, Isla Moretti, does your museum know that their curator is currently wearing a necklace that was stolen from a private collection in Vienna 3 years ago? Or are you simply unaware that your lover's family business includes trafficking in treasures that don't belong to them?" The accusation hung in the air between us like a blade poised to fall, and I felt my face flush with heat that was part embarrassment and part anger at being used as a pawn in whatever power play was unfolding between Dante and this woman who clearly had her own agenda. But before I could formulate any kind of response, Dante pulled me flush against his side and bent his head to press a kiss to my temple that looked tender but felt like a warning. Felt like him telling me without words to stay silent and let him handle this confrontation. "My family's business dealings are well known to everyone in this room, Lucia, and I see no reason to pretend otherwise among friends who understand how the world truly operates beneath the veneer of legitimacy that we all maintain for the benefit of authorities who lack the intelligence to see past carefully constructed facades," he said. And his voice had taken on that cold edge I'd heard during our first meeting, that quality that suggested violence lurking just beneath the surface of his civilized exterior. "As for Ela, she knows exactly what I am and what I do, and she has chosen to stand beside me anyway, because some women appreciate men who understand that power and beauty are often acquired through means that make lesser people uncomfortable with their own desires for what they cannot have through legitimate channels." The lie was so smoothly delivered, so convincing in its confidence, that I almost believed it myself, even as I stood there knowing that my presence at Dante's side was anything but voluntary, that I was playing this role under threat of harm to innocent people. And I watched Lucia's expression shift into something that might have been disappointment, or might have been calculation, as she reassessed whatever theory she'd been testing with her pointed questions about the necklace's provenance. "How very modern of you both. How very 21st century, to dispense with the pretense of morality and simply embrace the darkness that drives us all toward the things we want regardless of the cost," she said, stepping back with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, that promised this conversation was far from over, even as she prepared to disengage from our immediate vicinity. "I do hope you'll save me a dance later this evening, Dante, so we can discuss certain business matters that have been left unresolved between our families, matters that I suspect you'll find very interesting, given the recent developments in territories we both have significant investments in protecting." She glided away before Dante could respond, disappearing into the crowd of guests that filled the palazzo's grand ballroom with the kind of elegant menace that characterized everyone in attendance. and I felt Dante release a breath I hadn't realized he'd been holding. Felt the tension in his body ease fractionally as the immediate threat of Lucia's presence receded into the general danger of the evening. That woman is poison wrapped in Versace, and she has wanted me in her bed and under her control since we were teenagers learning the family business from our respective fathers, he murmured into my ear, his lips brushing my skin in a way that sent shivers down my spine despite everything. Despite knowing this was all performance and threat, and carefully calculated manipulation. She will try to get you alone at some point during the evening, will attempt to convince you that I am the villain in this scenario, and that she could offer you protection or escape if you would only betray my confidence. And when this happens, you will smile politely, excuse yourself, and find me immediately so that I can ensure her efforts to turn you against me fail as spectacularly as all her other attempts to undermine my family's position have failed. The evening stretched ahead of us like a minefield disguised as a party. And as Dante guided me deeper into the ballroom, filled with Rome's criminal elite dressed in their finest clothes, and hiding their worst intentions behind champagne flutes and perfect smiles, I realized with dawning horror that the photographs of innocent hotel workers weren't the only leverage he held over me. That he'd spent the car ride and these first interactions training me, preparing me, ensuring that when the real tests came, I would already be conditioned to turn to him for protection, to see him as my only ally in a room full of people who would happily destroy me if they knew the truth of how I'd come to be standing at his side wearing stolen jewelry and playing the role of the beloved companion to a man who dealt in violence and art with equal facility and complete absence of moral constraint. I stopped asking myself when I'd started wanting him and started asking myself why I'd fought it so long, especially when his mouth traced fire down my throat and his hands mapped territory on my body that already felt like it belonged to him when we tumbled through the door of his penthouse suite after the gala had descended into chaos and violence and the kind of revelations that shattered whatever remained of my carefully constructed understanding of the world I'd thought I inhabited. The evening had unraveled exactly as Dante had predicted it would, with Lucia cornering me in the Palazzo's Baroque powder room, while I'd been attempting to escape the suffocating weight of playing my role among criminals who smiled with their mouths while their eyes calculated the quickest ways to eliminate competition, and she'd whispered promises of protection and escape if I would only tell her what Dante was planning, what moves he was preparing to make in the territorial dispute that had everyone at the gala circling each other like sharks scenting blood in increasingly expensive waters. I'd done exactly as Dante had instructed, had smiled politely, and excused myself, and found him in the ballroom where he'd been engaged in conversation with Riccardo Valenti himself, and the look of approval in his winter storm eyes when I'd pressed close to his side and murmured that Lucia had approached me exactly as he'd warned, had sent a rush of something dangerous and intoxicating through my veins. Something that felt disturbingly like pride in having pleased him, in having played my role so well that even Lucia's attempts at manipulation had failed to shake my performance. The turning point had come during the dancing, when Dante had pulled me onto the floor amid other couples swaying to music played by a string quartet that probably cost more per hour than I made in a week, his hand spanning the small of my back, while his other hand clasped mine with a possessiveness that had stopped being entirely for show. Somewhere during the evening's progression from performance to something far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous to my sense of self-preservation. You are doing remarkably well for someone who walked into my world completely unprepared just 2 days ago. Piccola curatrice. So well that I find myself wondering if perhaps you are not quite as innocent as you appeared when you stumbled through that wrong door, wearing your rumpled travel clothes and your terror-like armor against the reality you'd discovered. He'd murmured against my ear as we moved together to music that seemed designed to lower inhibitions and encourage the kind of dangerous proximity that made rational thought increasingly difficult to maintain. His body had been solid and warm against mine, his cologne mingling with the scent of expensive wine and old stone and something else that I was beginning to recognize as uniquely him, as the combination of danger and elegance that characterized everything about Dante Sovereign and his carefully cultivated persona as a man who could move seamlessly between brutal violence and sophisticated charm without ever appearing to notice the contradiction. The chaos had erupted while we were still on the dance floor, had come in the form of shouting from the palazzo gardens, followed by the sound that I was learning to recognize as gunfire. And Dante's entire demeanor had transformed in an instant, from attentive lover to lethal predator, his hand moving to the small of my back, not in caress but in iron control as he'd maneuvered us toward the nearest exit. While around us, the gala's guests had reacted with varying degrees of alarm and practiced indifference that suggested this wasn't the first time their social events had been interrupted by violence. Kozlov had appeared as if summoned, his massive form creating a barrier between us and the panic spreading through the ballroom, and Dante had issued instructions in rapid Italian that had sent his enforcer moving toward the source of the disturbance, while he'd continued guiding me out of the palazzo and into the waiting car, with an efficiency that spoke of extensive practice in extracting himself from dangerous situations before they could fully develop into threats he couldn't control. In the car, he'd made phone calls, his voice cold and commanding as he'd demanded updates and issued orders to people I couldn't see. And I'd sat pressed against the leather seat, watching Rome's ancient streets blur past the tinted windows, while my heart hammered against my ribs and my mind struggled to process the reality that someone had been killed in those gardens, that the beautiful gala with its priceless art and elegant guests had been nothing more than a stage for the kind of violence that Dante navigated as casually as other people navigated office politics or family dinners. One of my cousins was found with his throat cut in the Valenti Gardens, murdered by someone who wanted to send a message that my family is vulnerable, that bringing you to that gala was evidence of my distraction and weakness rather than my confidence, Dante had finally said, ending his last call and turning to face me with an expression that was raw, in a way I hadn't seen before. Vulnerable beneath the fury that burned in those gray eyes like winter storms, finally breaking into the kind of tempest that destroyed everything in its path. I should have been terrified, should have used this moment of his distraction and grief to demand he release me, to insist that I'd played my role and earned my freedom. But instead I'd found myself reaching for him, found my hand moving of its own volition to touch his face in a gesture that was meant to comfort, but that ignited something between us that had been building since the moment he'd zipped up my dress earlier that evening, since he'd fastened the stolen necklace around my throat and looked at me like I was something precious rather than simply useful. He'd caught my wrist before my fingers could make contact with his skin, his grip firm enough to stop my movement but not painful, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made me feel stripped bare despite being fully clothed in the expensive dress he'd provided. Don't touch me out of pity, cara mia. Don't offer comfort that you don't truly want to give, because once I start responding to your touch in the way my body has been demanding, since I first saw you standing in that doorway, looking terrified and beautiful and completely out of your depth, I won't be gentle, and I won't be the kind of man you deserve. The kind of man who would take his time and treat you like you're fragile rather than like you're mine to claim in. Whatever way I choose, he'd warned. But even as he spoke, the words his thumb had been stroking the inside of my wrist where my pulse hammered against my skin. And I'd understood in that moment that we were both already lost, both already falling towards something that would complicate everything and change nothing about the fundamental imbalance of power between a captor and his captive. I'd kissed him first, had closed the distance between us in the back seat of that moving car, and pressed my mouth to his with all the reckless desperation of someone who'd spent 2 days living in a state of heightened fear and adrenaline and unwanted attraction to the beautiful monster who held her life in his hands. And he'd responded exactly as he'd warned he would, with a hunger that consumed rather than caressed, with hands that gripped and claimed rather than requested permission, with a dominance that should have terrified me but instead ignited something in my core that I'd never acknowledged existed in my carefully controlled existence back in Boston. By the time we'd reached the penthouse, we'd already crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, had already established through desperate kisses and roaming hands that whatever happened next would be inevitable. And when he'd pulled me through the door and pressed me against the wall of his bedroom, with his mouth on my throat, and his hands pushing the expensive dress up my thighs. I'd stopped pretending that this was anything other than what it was. A surrender to desire that had been building since our first confrontation. A capitulation to the magnetic pull between two people who should have remained enemies, but who'd somehow become something far more complicated in the span of just 2 days. Tell me you want this. Tell me you're choosing this, even knowing what I am and what I've done, because I need to hear you say the words before I take what I've been imagining taking since I first decided not to kill you. He'd demanded against my skin, and I'd understood that he was offering me one final chance to stop this. One last opportunity to preserve some boundary between us that might make it easier when this situation eventually resolved and I returned to my old life. But I'd been beyond caring about easier, or safer, or any of the principles that had governed my existence before I'd walked through that wrong door. My answer had been to pull his mouth back to mine, to wrap my legs around his waist and arch against him an invitation that required no translation, and whatever restraint he'd been maintaining had shattered completely, had given way to the kind of passionate intensity that obliterated thought and left only sensation, only the feeling of his hands stripping away fabric and inhibitions with equal efficiency, only the sound of our breathing harsh in the quiet luxury of his bedroom, only the overwhelming reality of finally surrendering to something I'd been fighting since the moment his cold, gray eyes had first assessed me and found me worthy of being kept alive for purposes that had evolved far beyond simple business necessity into something neither of us had anticipated or could now control. He'd orchestrated everything, the keycard, the meeting, even my trip to Rome, and when he walked back into that penthouse suite after spending the morning dealing with the aftermath of his cousin's murder, expecting to find me waiting in his bed where he'd left me tangled in silk sheets and the scent of our desperate coupling, he found me standing in his study, instead holding the gun from his nightstand, with hands that were surprisingly steady, even though my heart was obliterating itself against my ribs, my eyes fixed on the files spread across his desk that detailed months of surveillance on my life in Boston, photographs of me leaving my apartment and entering my museum and having coffee with colleagues who I'd thought were simply co-workers, but who were apparently involved in the art laundering operation that had brought me into Dante's orbit long before I'd ever booked a flight to Italy. The evidence of his manipulation was overwhelming in its thoroughness, in the way it documented every aspect of my existence down to my relationship with Marcus, my ex-fiancé, whose name appeared repeatedly in documents that connected him to the rival syndicate that wanted to destroy Dante's family business. And I watched something flicker across Dante's face when he saw me standing there armed and furious, and finally understanding the full scope of how completely I'd been used, how thoroughly he'd constructed this entire scenario to bring me into his world under circumstances that would make me dependent on him for survival, and therefore controllable in ways that a willing participant never would have been. You were never going to let me go, were you? You were never going to honor whatever promises you made about returning me to my life in Boston with enough money to disappear, because this was always about something bigger than just identifying traitors in your organization or getting information about my museum's acquisition process, I said, and my voice came out remarkably calm, considering the fury and betrayal churning through my system like poison, considering that I'd woken up an hour ago still wrapped in his arms and feeling something dangerously close to contentment, before curiosity and insomnia had driven me to explore the penthouse and discover the truth hidden in his private files. The keycard malfunction wasn't an accident. My room assignment wasn't a mistake. Even my entire trip to Rome was something you engineered by having someone send me that travel voucher disguised as a prize from a contest I never actually entered. And you did all of this because Marcus was using me to authenticate stolen pieces for your competitors, and you needed someone inside who was innocent enough to be believable, but compromised enough to be controllable once you'd drawn me into your world. He moved slowly into the study, his hands visible and empty in a gesture that might have been meant to appear non-threatening, but that I recognized as the careful approach of a predator who'd identified that his prey had developed claws, and when he spoke, his voice carried that same intensity I'd heard last night when he'd been buried inside me and demanding that I acknowledge what was happening between us, was more than just circumstance or coercion. Everything you've discovered in those files is true. Every photograph and every document represents months of preparation to bring you into a position where I could use your expertise and your connections and your complete ignorance of your ex-fiancé's criminal activities to dismantle an operation that was costing my family millions and threatening to expose networks we've spent generations building, he acknowledged. And there was something almost like respect in his expression as he assessed me standing there with his own weapon pointed at him, as if he'd always known this moment would come, and was pleased rather than alarmed that I'd finally uncovered the full extent of his manipulation. But you're wrong about one thing, Piccola Curatrice, wrong about the most important thing, which is that what started as manipulation and necessity has become something else entirely, something I didn't plan for and couldn't have predicted no matter how thoroughly I researched every aspect of your life before orchestrating our meeting. The words should have meant nothing, coming from a man who'd just been exposed as having controlled every element of my presence in his world, should have been dismissed as more manipulation designed to keep me off balance and confused about what was real and what was performance. But I heard the truth in his voice anyway. Heard something raw beneath the calculated charm that made my hands waver slightly, even as I kept the gun trained on his chest. What could possibly have changed? What could you have discovered about me in 2 days that would transform me from a tool you were using to achieve your goals into something more than that? And why should I believe anything you say when you've been lying to me from the moment we met? I demanded, even as my mind flashed back to the way he'd held me last night after the violence and the passion had finally exhausted us both, to the things he'd whispered in Italian while he'd thought I was sleeping, words I'd only partially understood, but that had sounded like confessions rather than commands. Before he could answer, the sound of shattering glass and shouting erupted from somewhere else in the penthouse, followed immediately by gunfire that was close enough to make my entire body flinch with recognition and terror. And Dante moved then, with that predator's speed I'd witnessed before, closing the distance between us and disarming me with practiced efficiency before pulling me toward a section of the wall that opened at his touch to reveal a panic room equipped with monitors and weapons and everything necessary for surviving an assault on the suite. The security feeds showed armed men flooding through the penthouse, Valenti soldiers based on the coordination of their movements, and I watched Dante's face transform into that cold mask of lethal calculation as he assessed the situation and began issuing instructions into a phone that connected him to Kozlov and other members of his security team who were apparently stationed throughout the building. Lucia has decided that killing me while I'm distracted by you is preferable to whatever long-term strategy her father was pursuing, and she's brought enough men to ensure that even if I survive the next hour, my reputation as someone who can protect his interests and his people will be sufficiently damaged to undermine my family's position for years to come, he said. And I heard in his voice not fear, but rather a kind of grim acceptance that this confrontation had always been inevitable, that the violence we'd witnessed at the gala was merely the opening move in a war that would be fought in this penthouse suite with me as an unwilling witness to whatever outcome emerged from the chaos. I should have stayed in the panic room where I'd be safe, should have let Dante handle the threat without my interference, but instead I found myself asking him how I could help, found myself offering to use my knowledge of the penthouse layout that I'd memorized during my captivity to create advantages he might not have considered. And the look he gave me in response was complex enough to contain surprise and gratitude, and something else that looked disturbingly like the emotion he'd claimed to feel earlier, before the world had exploded into violence again. We defended that penthouse together over the next hour, with me directing his movements through the monitors, while he eliminated threats with efficient brutality, until finally Lucia herself appeared on the security feeds, holding a gun to the head of the hotel maid I recognized from that first morning, the innocent woman whose photograph Dante had shown me to ensure my cooperation, and I watched his entire body go still with the recognition that this was the test Lucia had designed, the choice she was forcing him to make between eliminating her and saving someone who meant nothing to his organization, but everything to his leverage over me. The confrontation ended not with Dante's bullet, but with my own desperate improvisation. With me identifying through the security monitors a priceless Bernini sculpture in the room where Lucia held her hostage, and remotely triggering the fire suppression system that I'd noticed during my exploration of the penthouse, creating enough confusion and distraction for Dante to take the shot that ended Lucia's threat permanently, while I ran from the panic room to pull the terrified maid to safety, through corridors still echoing with the sounds of violence being resolved by men who served the sovereign family, with the kind of loyalty that came from generations of mutual obligation and shared profit. The aftermath was managed with the same efficiency that characterized everything in Dante's world, with police connections ensuring that the narrative became one of a robbery attempt gone wrong, rather than a family war played out in a luxury hotel. And when the authorities and the cleanup crews had finally departed, and we stood alone again in the wreckage of his suite, he'd offered me the choice I'd been waiting for since that first night. Return to Boston with a new identity, and enough money to disappear into whatever life I chose for myself. Or stay with him, and become not his prisoner, or his tool, but his partner in transforming his family's criminal empire into something that could eventually operate in the light, rather than in shadows. I should have chosen freedom, should have taken the money and the new identity and disappeared back into the safe, predictable existence I'd been living before that wrong keycard had opened the door to his world. But instead I'd found myself asking what he wanted rather than what he was offering. Found myself needing to hear him acknowledge that the connection between us had become something real rather than just convenient. And when he'd admitted that he wanted me to choose him, not because I was trapped, but because I saw all of him and stayed anyway, I'd understood that the woman who'd stumbled through that wrong door no longer existed. That 2 days in Dante Sovereign's world had transformed me into someone who could stand beside a man who dealt in violence and art and moral ambiguity with equal facility, and see not just the monster but the man beneath. Not just the criminal, but the complex human being who'd been shaped by circumstances and obligations that predated my existence, and would continue long after I'd made whatever choice would define the rest of my life. 3 months later, I stood beside him at an auction house that bore both our names, wearing his ring, and introducing him as my husband to art dealers and collectors who had no idea that the legitimate business we'd built together was funded by and gradually replacing the illegal operations that had brought us together. And when I caught his reflection in the glass case displaying a Caravaggio that had been recovered through means I'd learned not to question too closely, I saw in his winter storm eyes not possession but partnership, not control but something that looked dangerously close to the love that neither of us had been looking for, but that we'd found anyway, in the most unlikely of circumstances. I walked through the wrong door that night in Rome, stumbled into a nightmare that had transformed into something I couldn't quite classify as dream, but that had become undeniably mine, had become the life I'd chosen not because I had no other options, but because sometimes the most authentic version of ourselves only emerges when we're stripped of all the safe illusions we've constructed about who we're supposed to be, and forced to confront who we actually are when all the comfortable lies fall away and only truth remains, raw and terrible and somehow more beautiful than anything we could have planned or predicted or controlled.